And thanks for tuning in to Morning Live. Now, South Africa has, especially over the last couple of days, witnessed incidents ranging from femicide, attacks that have been characterized as xenophobic, and of course, family murders. And some argue that this has become a norm in our society and attributed to various socio-economic and political challenges faced by the country. But what are the underlying factors that have led to the current wave of unrest? And to help us try and contextualize these recent developments, we're joined by Terry Oakley-Smith, who is the founder and managing director at Diversi-T. And from our Cape Town studios, we have activist Hlengiwe Ndlovu. Thanks to both of you. And it's a pity that we are not getting together at, a more peaceful time, a more opportune moment, but I guess now's as good a time as any. But starting with you, Terry, it's just where we find ourselves at the moment, and many people are looking at the consequences now of the actions that have unfolded. But what are the causes, do you think? Why are we here? Why do we find ourselves as a nation grappling with the things we are right now?
I think we're in a very unfortunate situation of a combination of crisis, but also paralysis. We find ourselves kind of inert and unable to move. We look for our leadership, missing in action. And when I say leadership, I'm not just talking about the president, although he does seem to be missing in action, but I mean leaders of business, leaders of trade unions, leaders of schools even, leaders of universities. Where are the people who are leading us? And I think if you think back, and I know that I often get criticized for harking back to apartheid, but if you look back to apartheid and colonialism, people's lives on the ground have really changed very little, Sakina. Do you know the bottom 10% of South Africans have to live on 345 rand a month? How do you even feed yourself, let alone your family? And never mind the feed. This also results, obviously, in feelings of helplessness, feelings of anger. It results in the breakdown of families. And I think all of these factors together combine to bring us to where we are. And we look to others maybe to blame. We look for people of a different race. We look for women. We look to people who are here as foreign nationals. We look to children. And we're in this really unhealthy combination of looking at different kinds of South Africans to blame for the terrible situation we find ourselves in. And the femicide, the violence against women, is just one feature, a very important feature, because we make up more than half the population. But in fact, I think a woman is murdered in South Africa every 3 hours.
And these are the harrowing statistics that we have to contend with. And often, Hlengiwe, I think we actually don't know what to do with all of these statistics, never mind facing the realities of what is going on in this country. But as Terry mentions, harping back to what happened during apartheid, that trauma, that people underwent during that very tumultuous time in our country's history, have we dealt with that? And I think as I ask that, it's probably rhetorical because we haven't dealt with it. No. But how is that impacting on what we are dealing with right now? Hlengiwe?
Thank you, Sakina. Yes, a very difficult moment indeed. And you are right. We haven't healed from the trauma. So to set the record straight, what is happening right now, whether on the streets of Johannesburg or the war on women's bodies, is completely wrong. So there is no amount of hashtagging whatsoever that can correct that. But also, South Africa is an inherently violent nation. We haven't gotten time to deal with that trauma, really. The apartheid system itself, even the anti-apartheid struggles were very violent. Even post-1994, that dispensation itself, all those are violent processes that I don't think as South Africans we have had time really to deal with them. And as a result, we want to brand ourselves as a a rainbow nation, but in actual fact, we are not a rainbow nation, we are a wounded nation. We are a ticking bomb. And all these eruptions of violence have been nothing but symptoms of that ticking bomb. So I think Terry is right. Leadership is missing in action, like at all levels. And with the current crisis, I cannot say anything better than saying even our men in society are inherently violent. If you want to argue that, you want to argue with your friends, you want to argue with your uncles, whatsoever, but men are inherently violent. If you look at the pictures on the streets of Johannesburg right now, it is men who are at the forefront. If you look at the traumatic events of this week, wars on women's bodies, it is men at the forefront. And in terms of what we do with that, we always turn to the easiest scapegoat that we can hold on to and then say, okay, these people are doing this and that, which is very problematic. And that is why I have a problem with the concept of xenophobia in itself, because it kind of like obscures a lot and lets a lot of people get away with murder. Because if we do not address the causes of all these issues, if we do not point to the right issues, if we just, it's easier for us as a nation to say it's xenophobia, because then what that means, then we can withdraw to our little spaces and tweet. Africans cannot be foreigners in Africa, say no to xenophobia and all these things. And my worry with that is the people who are supposed to be responsible, because if we try to look at the real crisis in society, let alone the economic crisis or whatsoever, but let's take what is being thrown on the streets right now that is kind of like fueling these violent attacks. People are talking about the issues of drugs. And for us to say the problem is drugs in Johannesburg, it's a reality that we want to escape, because that will draw our main leaders, respectable business people, and all other people that are involved in these networks and everything. So it's easy to say it's xenophobia. When you talk about violence against women, it's easy to say because men are hungry, men are frustrated. I mean, we are all affected equally by this whole issue of poverty and all those things. But it's easier to say, okay, men, because they are struggling and then they are taking their frustrations over the bodies of women, which is very unfair and which is actually sickening and tiring, especially at this moment. Because when you start to address the root causing of these things, it's even difficult now to even open a discussion about how do we overhaul our system, our judicial system, in terms of addressing these wars on women's bodies, because it will touch on your leadership, it will touch on your pastors at the church, it will touch at high people at positions of power, and then it becomes difficult really to have a conversation. So when we obscure it in language, then it makes it better. It makes people kind of escape the reality.
What I'm hearing Hlengiwe saying is that we lack the courage to basically square up to the realities of the problems that we are facing, that we need to deal with. And as such, we try to obfuscate by using language and whatever other means we can to deal with these problems. But Terry, you said that leadership is lacking, and you explained what you meant by that. But in the absence of leadership, don't we have policies that could then at least help us, guide us in terms of dealing with these problems?
Well, we may have policies, but I think we've moved far beyond a situation where policies can help us. I mean, if you look at what happened yesterday, women protesting against gender-based violence were not even willing to listen to the Member of Parliament, Olive Shisana, who came to speak to them. People are furiously angry, and policies are not going to help. What we need is to be able to come together as a society. And civil society has a huge role to play. We can see that our politicians have let us down. We can see, as Hlengiwe said, that our pastors have let us down. We can see that no one is emerging in a situation that can actually lead South Africa. So maybe we as citizens, we as members of civil society, need to begin to look at what role can we play. How can I, in my small way, do something to bring about change in South Africa?
What about the role of communities then, Terry? Because, yes, civil society, government, we can look at everybody else, but ultimately, in the end, we live in these communities. So
Absolutely.
what sort of responsibilities do members within their communities need to take here?
Well, I think that's a huge issue, Sakina, and I think we've looked at that, for example, in the Cape Flats, the role of communities in terms of the drug wars that Hlengiwe was mentioning. But I mean, I think it's so ironic that people have turned on foreign nationals. I mean, foreign nationals make up a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of South Africa's income. People like me, white people, we own more than 3/4 of the income of South Africa. We own the top 2 levels of jobs in South Africa. And somehow we are inured from this. I'm not saying that people need to turn on white people, but I just find it so extraordinary that other Africans have become the victims, and that we haven't looked around at what is happening in South Africa. Why are we in this situation? Why are people feeling helpless, feeling vulnerable? Why are women not feeling safe? What are the root causes of this?
But some would argue, Hlengiwe, that it's because of the proximity that people who are being othered find themselves in with regard to those who feel aggrieved about whatever the situation may be, whether it be psychosocial, whether it be socio-economic, and that others, as foreign nationals have been othered, are finding themselves within, arm's length, within earshot of those who are angry. Whereas, as Terry says, perhaps white people in this instance who have benefited from a system in the past,
Who still benefit
from that system, are further away. But does that fully explain why we are seeing the levels of violence, for example, that's being perpetrated against foreign nationals?
I don't think that's true, Sakina. While maybe there are some elements of truth in that in terms of the proximity, but also maybe picking up from some of the conversations from Terry when she spoke about what do we do as communities and the question that you asked lately, I think is the way how we as a society have not been honest about confronting our own issues. And that's why also maybe before I say I have problems with the use of language, because that use of language, once you begin to say foreigners are taking away our jobs, then it becomes easier to channel your anger to the next person. But also this is a broader systematic problem, which is not only a problem here in South Africa, but also a global problem. If you look back in the history of capitalism, you will know that the backbone of every capitalist economy is migrant labor. And now that we are even having this whole issue, this conversation that we are having, because we are gone past using human labor, moving to the fourth industrial revolution, and what does that mean in terms of these bodies that are in the space? And because also I've said South Africa is an inherently violent society, and we haven't had ways to deal with that violence, and then it erupts in bits and pieces amidst ourselves, and then we find ourselves channeling this violence to each other, because in the space of helplessness, where there is no one to account, where there is no one to take a responsibility in terms of what is to be done or to offer leadership, then people are helpless. If you go on Twitter right now and look at what is happening, the tensions between South Africans and foreign nations, and you will see even old videos are being dragged to justify, and you will see that desperation amongst these people, the frustrations themselves about what is happening on the ground, and then you will see how it manifests within these everyday relationships.
But
the
you
problem is that when we see...
Sorry, Hlengiwe, you say that we are not confronting our problems. What exactly are our problems?
Our problem is that we're an inherently violent society, Sakina, and we haven't had ways to deal with that trauma. We haven't had ways to sit down and talk about how do we move on, how do we move forward as a nation. And even now, after this violence, after all this has been said and done, how do we even move forward? But also the other issue is especially on gender-based violence. We're speaking about lack of leadership, and this is decisive leadership in terms of what is to be done. Because from here, the best thing that could be done, you see, maybe they will set up another commission of inquiry and all that. That will be also wasting money, and there is no one to step forward and say, this is how the country should move forward. And a country without leadership, a country, not just in government, but also in political spaces, even in our communities, even at our own homes, where young girls are being raped, adopted, and everything. No one is offering any form of leadership there. And without any form of leadership, the country is in chaos. And I think that's why we find ourselves in this mess.
What's the way forward, Terry?
Well, I think that, one of the first things is that we must all, as South Africans, take individual responsibility and say, this is my country, what can I do in the space where I am? If I'm a mother, how am I bringing up my sons? What am I teaching my sons about women and about girls? If I have girls, daughters, what am I teaching them? So it starts in the home. And then in the school, what are the schools doing to imbue a sense of leadership, to imbue a sense of security for the children that they're actually teaching? We can see that our universities are, especially the women students, are doing a lot to try and make prominent the issue of gender-based violence. But then where is the business community at this time of crisis and inertia? Where are the trade unions? What support? So we need support from all sides. We need all of us, wherever we are, to actually look at what contribution can I make? What can I do as an individual? As a mother, as a community leader, as a politician, what can I do right now to help South Africa move into a different space, to make a different message, to promote a different image of our country? And I think the first thing that Hlengiwe said was so apposite. We are a wounded nation. And as long as we keep papering over the scars and not dealing with those deep wounds, these issues of violence are going to flare up in different times. It can be gender-based violence sometimes, it can be violence against foreign nationals, but we need to deal with those deep wounds that we have as South Africans that we've never dealt with. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be a violent society.
And Hlengiwe, how do we go about then dealing with the collective psyche of this nation? Because I remember years back when I was still doing a radio show on Metro FM, I once said that I think the country resembles, we should actually be one huge psych ward. Yes. Because we are so wounded as a nation. And I think that's when we first started talking about xenophobia and those horrible images that came through from Alexandra and the East Rand at the time. So how do we collectively deal with our psyche as a nation?
Sakina, I think we have to do this at all levels. First of all, the TRC did not give us anything, but it entrenched the wound that we were already having in such a way that we're then struggling to move forward now. But it begins from our own little circles. It begins from taking responsibility of our actions. Because even these conversations that we are having, even at home, it's so easy for us to come on social media and do the hashtags and everything, but we go back to our little spaces and then we join our colleagues. These people who are running on the streets of Johannesburg, who are doing all the violence and everything, even we need to take collective responsibility in all of this, what is happening, because these are the people we know. They live in our communities. They were friends. The rapists themselves, they are amongst us. So it's easier for us when we are thinking about how are we going to take up the land, and we can say the amendments, the sections of the Constitution should be amended. But when we're speaking issues of gender-based violence, you find divisions amongst women and men. And then you find our colleagues and even other women who will step forward and say, not all men. And the last time I wanted to make a point about the call for the death sentence. And as much as it is true that that is going to cost Black lives, but the conversation, the broader conversation is not about that. The conversation is calling on to the government, the judicial system, to look into how do we think about these crimes 25 years after our so-called democracy? How do we bring justice to the society? How do we make sure that it is socially, economically expensive for a rapist to live in a society where they've raped people? It begins at our little homes, at our little spaces with our friends, calling out our friends, telling them that your language is wrong, and all of those things. And once we have addressed those things, I think maybe we can begin to imagine. Even the use of violence is so endemic in such a way that the police, even themselves, they can let thousands of shops to get burnt down downtown, but when you call them upon women at parliament, it takes literally 3 minutes to disperse women who are gender activists, and that is a problem on its own. And that's why I'm saying we need leadership from all fronts, and also we as individuals, we need to do our little bit in terms of thinking about ways of moving forward.
Hlengiwe Ndlovu, Terry Oakley-Smith, unfortunately we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us this morning and talking about, you know, very difficult conversation and trying to deal and grapple with what's happening in South African society at the moment and the violence that accompanies much of what is happening. But it's time now for the news with Leanne.